In Amazing Spider-Man #2 from Marvel Comics, Spidey falls through a fever dream of hallucinations where he's attacked by villains on all sides, with Norman Osborn being his savior. Is Norman real? Is he a dream? Or something in between? Let's find out in 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to Comical Opinions. After reading through Amazing Spider-Man #2, there are pieces that I like, but there's one big red flag that catches my attention, not in a good way. Writer Joe Kelly stirs up this mystery about somebody or something that's using hallucinogens and other chemicals to drive people crazy, and Spider-Man starts off in the issue falling victim to that. But at the very end, we find out that the shadowy figure that was teased in issue #1 is basically a one-time, one-off villain that Joe Kelly himself created way back when in 2016. We've seen that playbook before. Zeb Wells wrapped his entire What Did Peter Do arc around a character that Zeb Wells created, brought back specifically for that purpose, and look how that turned out. That run gave us Paul, probably the most hated person in all of Marvel Comics, maybe even all of Western comics. I'm not eager to see that situation repeated. So if Joe Kelly's going to bring back one of his personal villains and repeat the process, to him I say, no thank you, sir. No thank you. Let's talk about the pros and cons, starting with what's great about Amazing Spider-Man #2. I think at the heart of this issue and the arc as a whole, there's an interesting mystery that's taking place. Spidey's got hallucinations he's trying to fight through, and you get a cavalcade of different villains that only appear briefly, but they're good enough. And then you find out that there is some kind of drug that's at the heart of what Peter's experiencing. Now there is some hand-waving and such, but we do find out that there's some kind of chemical problem that created that vision. So there's a mystery about what the chemical is, who created it, why they created it, what does Hobgoblin have to do with this, and what is his shadowy figured hench person, which I'll spoil in a little bit, but not right now. What do they have to do with any of it? So there's some mystery here. It's a basic mystery, but it's pretty well done. When you pile on top of that, Pepe Larraz does a great job with the art. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then on top of that, you get a little bit of a hook with Norman Osborn, who is now part of the story in sort of a Alfred to Batman kind of role. So I think that's a little bit interesting, a little bit different than what we've seen before, and I like where that's headed. So what's not great about Amazing Spider-Man #2, it really comes down to two, I would say, significant flaws. The first one involves a major spoiler. If you don't want to know, turn back now. I am going to reveal the identity of the shadowy hench person. If you don't want to know, please stop right here, right now. Okay? You still with it? All right. The shadowy hench person, we find out at the end of the issue, it's Itsy Bitsy. Now, if you're saying, who the hell is Itsy Bitsy? That's a good question, because it's a Joe Kelly villain creation that only appeared once in one Marvel team-up type miniseries between Spider-Man and Deadpool way back in 2016. So this is a character that was invented 9 years ago by the same writer, hasn't shown up again since, hasn't been referenced or talked about since, and there's a reason for that, because nobody cares about Itsy Bitsy. It's a one-off character that's a spider derivative and kind of dopey, and nobody cares. So when you have Amazing Spider-Man, who is the flagship character starring in the flagship book of Marvel that is right now in a bad state for flagship book, and your genius idea is to bring back a one-off D-list villain that hasn't been seen in 9 years, that's how you're going to reinvigorate the title? I don't know what Joe Kelly was smoking when he came up with that one, but that's not a good plan. It sounds really tone deaf, and especially since we've just gone through that problem with Zeb Wells when he did What Did Peter Do arc, and that wind up generating Paul and doing all kinds of dumb things. We've seen that model before. We do not like that model. we don't like that model at all, and we don't want to see it come back. And here Joe Kelly seems to be repeating it. So I'm really put off by the idea of using Itsy Bitsy to kind of breathe some life into the series. Now you might say, well, you got to try some new things. Okay, fine, but there's a reason Itsy Bitsy didn't catch on as a villain. So I'm not sure why anybody thought that was a good idea. The second problem with this issue is there's a lot of hand-waving going on. You don't want to see hand-waving, especially in a comic book that's wrapped around a mystery. For example, Norman Osborn rescues Peter when he's about to jump off a building or do something crazy, takes him back to the lab and examines him, he just jumps to the conclusion that Peter was poisoned by some kind of gas when he went to Rhino's apartment. There's no evidence for it. There's no clue to kind of lead him to that conclusion, but he just suddenly makes that proclamation. Then, when Spidey goes off and says, I know you want me to rest, but I can't just sit here and do nothing, he goes off because he assumes that Rhino's the key, even though Randy, in the last issue, came back and said that all these families around that same area have all been affected. Well, if he's going to be a detective, why isn't he doing detective work? Why does he go back to Rhino? I know that's more dramatic and exciting, but it's really poor detective work and, again, not what you want in a mystery. And then last, he just so happens to show up at the same time when Itsy Bitsy is there also in Ravencroft to try and kill Rhino. So what you see is over and over again these little coincidences that stack up over and over and over again. One or two, you can get away with it. When you start to get to 2 and 3 and 4, now you got a problem on your hands. And so if you're going to write a mystery, you've got to cover all your bases, and too much hand-waving, too much coincidence is not a good thing. All right, let's switch gears and talk about the art. So we have Pepe Larraz on pencils and inks, and we have Joe Caramagna on the colors. And together, they really nail this issue or what it tries to accomplish. The first half of the issue, roughly, maybe a little bit more, is all taken up with Spidey trying to fight through a series of hallucinations from one location to the next to the next. You're very off kilter, you're very disoriented, you're not quite sure what's real and what's not. Larraz accomplishes that through a series of layouts and panels where things are a little bit off-center. They're not very symmetrical, but they capture the idea that you're flipping back and forth. You're not quite sure if what you're seeing is real or not. Then on top of that, Joe Caramagna does a great job with creating distinction between the reality of what's going on in the world versus some color saturation that shows what Spidey is experiencing in his mind. So even though all the panels are laid out in weird, wonky ways, it's really easy to follow. It helps tell the story, and it creates that atmosphere of disorientation that puts you in the mindset of what Spidey's experiencing. So overall, great job from the art team. All right, if you need some context, here's what happened in the last issue, which is Amazing Spider-Man #1. Peter ran through this gauntlet of job interviews only to be selected eventually by Rand Enterprises for a position with some weird out-of-the-way scientific department. It just so happens that the reason he got this job was due to a childhood friend who also works at Rand by the name of Brian Nearing. While he's on his first day tour and figuring out what's going on, he spots Rhino rampaging down the middle of the street. Of course, it's the Parker luck, so he has to suit up, make an excuse, fights Rhino, and during the fight, Rhino has a heart attack. Now, Spider-Man eventually saves him with CPR, but a little bit later we find out that Rhino has some kind of weird chemical in his body that made him go berserker, and the person who doesn't want anybody to know about the chemical is Hobgoblin. And he orders some shadowy figure in the corner to go take care of any loose ends and make sure nobody investigates that chemical. Spidey later goes to Reiner's apartment to figure out what's going on, and all of a sudden he gets whammied with these hallucinations about all the villains he's ever fought. And that brings us to the current issue, Amazing Spider-Man #2. We pick up from the cliffhanger. Spider-Man jumps through Rhino's window down to the streets below as he's being attacked on all sides by this cavalcade of Spider-Man villains. Now, of course, none of it is real, but he's going crazy, throwing stuff at them, cars, smashing dumpsters, doing all the things. In the real world, people see Spider-Man and they think he's gone nuts. And of course, it's being captured on television for the news, which is not a good thing. Eventually, the scene shifts over, and then all of a sudden, Peter wakes up. He's in the middle of his tour again at Rand Enterprises. He doesn't know how he got there, but he's picking up all this information about what's going on with Rand. And part of that tour is with Brian Nearing again, his childhood friend, and Brian shows him that he's working on this lab with all this mushroom fungi type stuff that is part hallucinogen, part medical research, and then all of a sudden he disappears again. And then he's up on the roof of Rand where he's fighting who he thinks is a Green Goblin, but it turns out to be just Norman Osborn. Norman sweeps him up, takes him back to a lab, and gets him all better. Examining his blood, he finds out that Peter's been poisoned by some kind of concoction of hallucinogens he's never seen before, and he sort of draws a conclusion that it was something let loose that's airborne, some kind of gas in Rhino's apartment, and he needs to rest and take it easy. Of course, he's not going to listen. So Peter suits up as Spider-Man and he heads to Ravencroft where Rhino is recovering from his heart attack and whatever chemicals were in his system. He meets up with Shay. Shay still doesn't know that Peter is Spider-Man, so he's playing the whole, I'm Peter's friend bit to try and get inside to make sure that Rhino's okay and maybe do a little detective work. Suddenly, they hear an alarm going off, all kinds of noise that's indicating that some kind of break-in is occurring. Spider-Man rushes down to where Rhino is located, and who does he see there on top of Rhino, about ready to stab him? Maybe. Doesn't quite look clear about exactly what's about to happen. And who is it? It's Itsy Bitsy. Final thoughts when we think about Amazing Spider-Man number 2. It gives you a pretty decent mystery. Not a great one, but a pretty decent one, and you get one more villain than you thought you had before. Joe Kelly's script successfully creates this feeling of disorientation when Spidey's mind goes wild with the drugs he's been infected with, and the art is pretty darn good, and that's probably the highlight of the issue. Unfortunately, the new villain that's added to the cadre is a one-off D-lister that I don't think anybody's really going to remember, which is not what the series needs to get it bumped up. And the progress of the mystery is somewhat hamstrung by too much hand-waving and leaps and conclusions that just don't feel satisfying. Therefore, Amazing Spider-Man number 2 from Marvel Comics earns a 6 out of 10. Leave a thumbs up if you felt this review was helpful, and let us know in the comment section down below. Itsy Bitsy might not be the best choice for the next villain that Spider-Man's going to face, but if you had your choice, who should the next villain be? Is it somebody we haven't seen in a very long time? Is it a one-off character that deserves a little reinvention, or is it somebody more classic like, say, the Vulture, as an example? Let me know in the comments section. So, thank you very much for joining, and stay tuned through the outro for more reviews just like this one.